Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. We're looking at a fascinating broadcast where Sky News Australia systematically took aim at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, or the ABC. When media giants turn their analytical lenses on each other, it gives us this incredible window into journalistic standards and perceived media bias. Today, we're dissecting a very specific segment featuring media watchdog Jared Henderson. Now, our goal here? It's not to take sides. We're simply going to clearly, impartially map out the exact anatomy of this critique. Now, what's really interesting here is how one specific quote sets the stage for a massive debate about media bias. Speaking on the ABC program Insiders, Nikki Sava criticized Liberal politician Angus Taylor for defending a preference decision involving the One Nation Party. Sava argued this sent a signal to Liberal voters that it was somehow okay to vote for One Nation. Her exact words? She said the move was wrong politically and it was wrong morally. And it's that word right there, morally. This assertion of morality in a standard political preference deal that absolute triggers the intense pushback from the Sky News panel. To understand exactly how Sky News constructs its broader argument against the ABC, we are going to break down their broadcast into three distinct case studies: debating voter legitimacy, the press conference clash, and questioning editorial standards.
All right, let's move right into Section 1, debating voter legitimacy.
So, the core conflict boils down to this. On one side, you have the ABC's Nikki Sava labeling a liberal preference decision immoral because she suggests it legitimizes One Nation for voters. But on the flip side, Sky News argues this is a deeply demeaning stance. Jared Henderson breaks this down. He argues that the ABC's logic essentially implies previous liberal voters are, in his words, so dumb that they literally needed the Liberal Party to legitimize their choices via a preference ticket. Sky News is contending that voters are completely capable of making up their own minds. To treat a preference flow as a moral failing, well, they say that's effectively treating the electorate like they're stupid.
And the raw data paints a really fascinating picture here. Jared Henderson points out that One Nation secured roughly 25% of the vote across the country in the specific context they're discussing. Think about that, a quarter of the electorate. He goes even further, noting that in the electorate of Farah, they actually approached 40% of the primary vote. Sky News is bringing out these numbers to anchor their argument in democratic reality, rather than what they see as moral judgment.
Henderson's point is that capturing a quarter of the electorate grants a political party inherent legitimacy, regardless of whether media commentators personally like them or not. He suggests that when well-educated ABC journalists label this massive voting bloc immoral, they're essentially looking down their noses at everyday voters. The Sky News panel diagnoses this as a symptom of the ABC mixing only within their own, frankly, limited social and professional bubbles. They argue that projecting this opinion, especially when you're using taxpayer-funded cameras and studios to do it, is pure elitism. It shows a glaring disconnect from a massive chunk of the Australian public.
So the crucial takeaway Sky News offers here is that there's absolutely zero causal connection between the ABC's moral outrage and actual voter behavior. In fact, Henderson highlights this really fascinating inverse relationship. The more the ABC criticizes, the more the One Nation vote actually seems to grow. The Sky News panel concludes that this dynamic says a whole lot more about the ABC's internal culture than it does about the voters. Basically, the electorate simply doesn't care if a commentator finds their political views immoral.
Okay, moving on to Section 2, the press conference clash.
Now, when the ABC was physically excluded from a One Nation press conference, Media Watch host Linton Besser went on the offensive. Besser actually framed this block as an attack on the body politic itself. He described election reporting as a sacred responsibility and suggested that if the ABC was blocked because of their tough reporting, it was effectively a cunning electoral ploy. So the ABC's stance is very clear. Denying them access is fundamentally undemocratic, and it harms public debate.
This exact scenario prompted the Sky News panel to ask a really fundamental question about the legal rights versus the privileges of the press. Specifically, does a media organization, even a taxpayer-funded one, possess an automatic, undeniable right to walk into any political press conference, or is access strictly granted at the discretion of the event organizers?
Well, Sky News completely rejects the ABC's framing of this whole issue. Henderson counters that political parties have the absolute prerogative to block organizations they deem to be dodgy or heavily biased against them. Now, to be fair, the Sky News host mentions they personally wouldn't block journalists just because, well, it's not a great look. But they draw a very sharp line between a good PR strategy and actual legal rights. They argue forcefully that getting into a private press conference is a privilege. It is not some mandate enshrined in law.
It's literally a complete clash of worldviews here. While the ABC views their exclusion as a literal silencing of democratic debate, the Sky News panel looks at that reaction and calls it pure arrogance. Henderson actually points out the irony of the ABC complaining about silenced debate when, in his view, the ABC doesn't even host genuine debate on its own network. Sky News describes the ABC's reaction as this "I am the center of the universe" mindset, this entitlement where the broadcaster assumes the public can only get valid news through their specific lens, all while completely ignoring the fact that other brilliant journalists from different outlets were allowed in and reporting on the exact same event.
And that brings us to our final case study, Section 3, Questioning Editorial Standards.
For this one, Sky News highlighted a specific ABC National segment hosted by Nick Bryant. The segment featured a guest named Sarah Wilson, whom the Sky News panel somewhat mockingly described as an end-of-the-world specialist. Henderson made a point to note the irony here. Wilson actually started her career as a cooking expert before suddenly pivoting to global geopolitical affairs. This framing by Sky News is very intentional. It immediately sets up skepticism about the guest's credentials right out of the gate before even getting to her actual claims.
And what were those claims? Well, during that ABC segment, this guest boldly stated that only 7% of the global population currently lives in a liberal democracy. 7%! It's a shocking, incredibly tiny statistic, obviously meant to highlight a severe global democratic decline.
But here's where Henderson absolutely hammered ABC host Nick Bryant for just letting this massive claim slide. The Sky News panel actually did the math on this. They pointed out that for the global democratic population to be only 7%, you would logically have to exclude massive populations from that count. Henderson speculated that the guest must have completely forgotten to count both the United States and the United Kingdom.
Sky News points to this unchecked 7% statistic as a prime example of what they call a classic problem. You see, for them, it's not just about one guest getting a number wrong on live radio. It's about the host completely failing to push back or correct the record in real time. Sky News uses this specific moment to really question the underlying editorial standards of the taxpayer-funded broadcaster. They're suggesting that the ABC's failure to fact-check a narrative, as long as it aligns with a certain worldview, is a major breach of their journalistic duty.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this thought. When major media networks spend significant time critiquing and analyzing each other's standards, access, and biases, what does that actually mean for the average voter's access to genuinely unbiased information? We've seen today how Sky News meticulously deconstructs the ABC's coverage, painting this picture of an elitist, out-of-touch, and editorially flawed organization. Meanwhile, the ABC views itself as the sacred defender of the body politic against dangerous political forces. So how does this fierce media watchdog divide shape our own understanding of the news landscape? Honestly, it's a critical question to keep in the back of your mind the very next time you watch any political coverage.